Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Path 11 podcast. My guest today is Sylvia True, and I'm really excited to speak with her because we are going to blend a little bit of healing, paranormal stuff, and mental health and psychology in with a very interesting experience that some of you may have family lineage that you can relate to with Sylvia's story. But she wrote a book called Where Madness Lies. And it's a story about hope and redemption, about what we pass on both genetically and culturally. It's about the high price of repression and how one woman who lost nearly everything must be willing to reveal the failures of the past in order to save future generations. And this book that she wrote, Where Madness Lies, is based on a true story of her own family. So, Sylvia, I don't want to give too much away. Welcome to the Path 11 podcast.
Oh.
And, I didn't mention that Where Madness Lies is a story about the high price of repression in Nazi Germany. But I really wanted you to kind of start with the history of your family, maybe the inspiration for this book. And then we'll kind of go into talking about how the Nazis treated those with mental illness. And we'll talk about kind of that ambiguity between mental illness and paranormal experiences. And we'll just have a lot of fun with this conversation today.
Okay, thank you for having me. And just so you know, I'm willing to talk about anything, which is sort of partly what my book's about too. And it ties into one of the themes in the book as well. So anyway, a little bit about myself. Both my parents were born in Frankfurt, Germany. They were both from Jewish families, and they both fled. My mother's family fled to Switzerland a little bit earlier on, closer to like 37-ish. And my father's family just made it out and they fled to England. And then my parents met later in London when my mother was skating. She became a Swiss national champion skater. And my father was a theoretical nuclear physicist. And they married and had 4 children. And he had a sabbatical outside of Chicago at Argonne National Labs. And that's sort of how we ended up in this country. And I now live in Boston. So that's a little bit of the backstory of my family. But the story Where Madness Lies is based on the bones of the story are true, basically. Some of the historical pieces I sort of added in. They're true historically. They're not maybe necessarily connected to my family in the way I connected them in the novel, hence a novel versus a memoir, right? And anyway, so my grandmother on my mother's side was from a very wealthy family, and she was a brilliant woman. And she had a younger sister, who was also brilliant and beautiful and a pianist and an artist. And she was mentally ill. And this was in the early 30s. And, times were getting really tricky in the early 30s with the Nazis and mental illness and sterilization. And my grandmother tried everything to help her sister. She did a ton of research. They sought out the best doctors. Eventually, Rigmore was the sister's name, ended up in a mental institution at, the worst time ever for mental patients in Germany. So in Germany, a little bit of history about Germany, eugenics, which is like race purity, right, was huge all around the world. It wasn't just Germany. In fact, America at that time in the early 30s, they were leading in sterilizations. But in 1933, Germany enacted the sterilization law, and people with mental illness, alcoholism, congenital blindness, feeble-mindedness, whatever that is, were all sterilized. And they sterilized about 400,000 people during 34 and 39. And then they came up with the euthanasia laws, which directly affected my grandmother and her sister. So my grandmother ended up fleeing to Switzerland and really having nothing. She lost her status, her money, her husband. He was the one person in our family who wasn't Jewish. He wouldn't be able to keep his job as a professor in chemistry if he was married to a Jew. So all these things she lost. When she went to Switzerland, I think what happened to her, which is not uncommon, she took all that trauma, put it in a box and pushed it away. And she became kind of a rigid, controlling person, which wasn't what she was like in her youth. But, all the things she couldn't control, she then sort of tried to control what she could. Like, for example, she made sure every clock in her house rang at exactly the same time every day. I mean, so she became the matriarch of our family. She was often displeased with us if we didn't look or act perfect. I mean, we were not allowed to show any weakness, especially mental weakness. I had no idea why. I don't know why I knew I was quote unquote weak. I mean, my father always said I was oversensitive. So anyway, I was raised partly in Switzerland and partly in the US. And so then in my 20s, I was depressed my whole life. I had a significant depression, but I kept it at bay as best I could. You know, I struggled. I thought I was weaker, but I pushed myself. But in my 20s, it got really bad and I couldn't drive anymore. The panic attacks were terrible. I felt like I was walking on a tightrope and I didn't know when I was going to fall off, but I knew I was going to fall off and I had no idea what to do or where to go for help because in our family, we weren't allowed to seek mental health professionals. And then I decided, well, I know what will fix this. I'll have a baby. Well, obviously, this is probably not the best idea, although the result was beautiful. And I have my eldest daughter, Erica, is amazing. Anyway, I had a baby. On top of that, then was a postpartum depression, and I landed in a mental hospital, McLean, which is outside of Boston. It's a very well-known hospital, and that was like the best education of my life. It was an amazing experience. It was difficult, but I grew and I learned. And at that time, initially, my grandmother and my mother wouldn't even talk to me. They were too terrified, and I didn't know why they were terrified. And the doctors would ask when you first admitted to a place like that, is there any mental illness in the family? I was like, absolutely not. Everybody's perfect, but me. I'm the black sheep. So slowly, my mother and grandmother, especially my grandmother, came to help and sort of revealed this piece of her past. It was very painful for her to revisit this. But in doing so, she allowed me to be free. And I think both of us came to finally understand each other. You know, I had thought she was like the Wicked Witch of the West and just a total bitch. And she had thought I was, weak and whatever. I mean, we dropped those prejudices, I guess, when we exposed our fears to each other. And we finally were able to connect and find a path to love and openness. And it sort of drew the whole family eventually out of the dark. My sister's a very well-known child psychiatrist. And so it was an amazing experience. And I talk about mental health to my students as well. I'm a chemistry teacher, and I talk about paranormal stuff with them as well. But just to keep an open mind and to sort of hope that some of the stigma, I mean, there's a lot less stigma, but, it would be nice if there was none. We could talk about it like we talk about diabetes. Anyway, that was a long opening.
No, that was great. That was great. And, it kind of reminds me a little bit of the teachings of A Course in Miracles, that when you begin to shine the light on something, like it can no longer hide and things begin to heal, and when we're doing kind of like the work with the ego and trying to bring the spirit, into things and kind of shed some of these fears, when you said that, your grandmother finally opened up and shared this, then there was like a breaking down, probably of the battle of the wills a little bit there, and love and understanding was able to enter into your relationship.
Right, because I think, and I mean, I used to think this was kind of a trite thing to say, but if there's fear, there almost can't be love. You know what I mean? It sort of blocks. It blocks. Fear does block, and I think that there was an understandably enormous amount of fear on my mother's side of the family because of what happened. And that, that causes anxiety and, then it is hard. And I mean, even, I know this is sort of off the topic, but in these crazy times we're living in, my book, in a way, I hope will remind people that you need to sit down and understand the other and understand where their fears lie, because it's so easy to get angry and point fingers and blame. and to really understand the other person. And I mean, I think, both shame and fear, and those were both really prevalent in my family, they do build walls. And if we want to break down those walls, those are the things I think we have to like really get past.
Yeah. Now, looking back, kind of hindsight at what was going on with you and your battle with depression, I know that you had written an article or an essay in Psychology Today saying that mental health might be something that we inherit. Where do you think, looking back, where did your depression come from? Do you feel like it is connected to the genetics of what your ancestors had gone through, and that was still within you? We kind of talk about epigenetics and things of that sort.
Right.
Or do you think it was kind of, a little bit of environment of what you were taught or what you were being role modeled in the emotional state and how to kind of like suppress them? So I'd like to hear your views on that.
So I've always been fascinated by like how much is genetic, how much is environmental. When I was in college, which was forever ago, I mean, we were taught 80% was environmental and only 20% was genetic. And I think we can say that that's a little lopsided, and maybe it's closer to 50-50, although again, it's impossible right now to really tease out exactly which is which. In my family, and I think that it's often the case. I mean, there's definitely a genetic component. I mean, you can see it runs through my family from, my mother, my great aunt, me. Both my daughters have struggled with depression and anxiety. The difference, which I'm really proud of all the things I've done, I think I'm most proud in many ways of being a mother, because when my eldest daughter, Erica, who I had to stop my depression, right, when she was around 14, I mean, she showed clear signs of, depression and was turning to things maybe that weren't so good for her. And I immediately, brought her to a therapist, a psychiatrist, and a psychic, because I wanted A, to address the problem openly, and B, to get it treated immediately. So she didn't have to like walk around feeling, the way I felt so much of the time, which was like barely hanging on. And I am proud that both my daughters have no shame around this. You know what I mean? And I think they're a little, I'm not going to say they're too open, because obviously their mother's pretty open, but I mean, to them, it is nothing. Like, it's not a big deal at all. Like, oh yeah, I take Prozac. Well, doesn't everybody? I mean, not that everybody should. And that's not what I'm saying. It's just the lack of shame they carry is beautiful to me, because that, if anything, that is what I wanted to do as a parent, was break that shame that was running from generation to generation. And you bring up that, epigenetics is really fascinating. And, I need to keep learning more about it, but you do wonder, especially, things get passed on. And yes, partly genetic, and I do think it's partly genetic, but I think that, passing on shame and fear happens in so many families. I mean, yeah, sure, my family had a big secret with the Nazis and mental illness, and that's like a little bit, I don't know, I want to say dramatic, but I don't mean it in a negative way. But I think many families, have secrets and want everybody to look fine and perfect and have shame, and that, that's something we all have in our families. And I do think that above all, that gets passed on so strongly.
So that's an interesting combination that you brought them to, right? A therapist, psychiatrist, and a psychic, you said. So tell me a little bit more. Why did you decide to bring a psychic into the mix of the treatment plan?
Right. Because, okay. So now, first of all, I come from extremely scientific background, right? So after I got out of McLean, I felt free, and I felt it was such an interesting, it wasn't just freedom, but what I had more than anything was curiosity. And that had been shut down when I was depressed. And I am a very curious person. I'm curious about everything, just absolutely everything. And so after I got out of McLean and I was feeling much stronger, and my mind was opening up basically. And I met I met a friend and he told me that his mother was psychic. And I was like, well, that's BS. Nobody's psychic. Nobody believes in that. That was against another thing that it was another hurdle I had to jump through, interestingly enough, because I'm a chemistry teacher. I come from the science background. We're not allowed to believe in stuff like that. That's for the less educated in much of my family believes. But I was curious, and I went to see this woman named Sophie, and she read regular cards, not tarot cards. And I don't know if you know, regular cards actually weren't made for playing games. They were actually designed to read people's futures. They were designed for fortune telling. She blew me away in that first reading, and that opened my mind. And I saw her for 30 years. She died about a year ago. She was 91. And I just can't imagine what my life would have been without her and her unbelievable gift. And it left me in awe so many times. And I knew that when Erica, was struggling, I know, of course, a therapist and a psychiatrist can help as well. I'm not suggesting one's better than the other. They're very different. But the thing that Sophie did that often a psychiatrist won't do, right, is Sophie just reads what's actually going on. And so, that pushed Erica to be more open, whereas a psychiatrist might say, how are you feeling? That must be difficult. Sophie would be like, you're choosing to do drugs and drink right now. So that was right out on the table. And Sophie was a dear friend. I have so many unbelievable stories about her. Anyway, so yeah, the psychic was good.
Yeah, and I am familiar. We actually had a guest on our podcast. I have his book actually here because I reference it a lot, Robert Lee Camp, and he taught us about how those cards were used, and he's created like this whole system to it to be able to read these cards. And I was blown away because, a deck of cards. I've played a deck of cards my whole entire life. Right. Never knew that they were really used more for readings and stuff like that. So yes, I am very familiar with that. So tell me a little bit more about some of your belief in the paranormal, and how does that kind of can sometimes mix in with what I guess our Western definition can be called, mental illness. Like if you look at schizophrenia or psychosis, right, in kind of the tradition of mental health, and then you look at some people that are having a spiritual experience and that maybe they are hearing voices or getting messages or seeing things from a different reality or maybe a past life, that we can easily classify that as being mentally ill.
Yeah, it's very fascinating. And I'm not a therapist, and nor would I ever label somebody's psychosis as either paranormal or maybe true mental illness. But there definitely have been people. There's a character in my book who was basically institutionalized she saw spirits, and she was deemed crazy. And her story in the book is that there was a fire in the group home she lived in, and she knew about the fire before it happened. And obviously, because she knew about it and tried to warn people, she was blamed for it. And there are a couple of reasons I put her in the book. One, I think, in terms of story, the most important reason is that she pushes on the grandmother's, I'm going to say, closed-mindedness to that kind of thing. So one of my favorite sayings, and I tell my students all the time, only a closed mind is certain. And I think the process of both characters' growth in the book is to become more open, not only to each other, but to other realities as well. And the character who has the visions, the visions are very clear, and the grandmother sort of has to begin to accept those. And that's one of the pieces. And, obviously, I believe that sort of, these generations before and after are all connected. So it's a very important element for me because of my beliefs. that's not what the book, the book is not just about that, obviously, but those things were very important for me. And it was very important for me to put in a character like that.
Yeah. And do you have any of your own stories that you'd like to share about any paranormal experiences or visions that you've had that allowed you to expand maybe outside of your own box?
Yeah. So I think my journey with all of this has been just wonderful, actually, in terms of growth and open-mindedness. And what it's done for me, and I'll get back to a couple of stories, but what it's done for me is I think we all come into this world, not come into this world, but we all judge, right? And, certainly my family, their intellectualism, they were very judgmental. And I think I was judgmental. And I think that the journey for me, part of it is letting go of judgments, because you begin to accept that we don't know so much. And so you begin to question, well, why did that happen? Was that, guided through spirit? And I think that has made a huge difference in my life. And it's funny because when I started seeing Sophie, which is over 30 years ago, I knew that there was no way. She knew stuff that there was no way, no way she could research. No, she just, she knew it. And so I believed that, there was psychicness. But it was funny how closed I was to other things. I was like, yeah, but I don't believe in mediums. And now I kind of laugh at myself because, if you believe in one, why wouldn't you believe in the other? Oh, and then I believed in mediums, but I didn't believe in past lives until I started doing a lot of research into that. So the more research I did and the more people I visited, and I also ran up against some really pretty big name frauds. And one of my colleagues and I did a sting operation on this man who, I would never say his name, but it was pretty awful. And through all of that, I've just had some amazing experiences. I think of one of the stories with Sophie. There are so many, but when Erica, my eldest daughter, was pregnant with her first child, she went to have an ultrasound, and it was on New Year's Eve. And the ultrasound technician said something to her about that she saw something like an artery in the baby's head. And Erica had just had a miscarriage. So, she called me. I was in Chicago. She was in Boston. She called me. She really couldn't speak. She was so upset and distraught, and understandably. This is her first pregnancy. She just had a miscarriage. The ultrasound technician said something she didn't understand. I thought, artery in the baby's head? That doesn't make sense. I don't know what she's talking about. I became, of course, panicked and worried and nervous. And I have a number of doctors in my family, one brilliant radiologist, but I didn't call them. I called the psychic. I called Sophie. And Sophie read some cards over the phone and said, no, the baby's fine. There's nothing wrong with the baby. I don't know what Erica or the other woman's talking about. She said, the baby's fine. She said, but Erica can't have sex for 2 weeks. I was like, well, I'm not going to be telling her that. That's a little too much. And she kept repeating, she can't have sex for 2 weeks. Something hasn't moved yet. And after 2 weeks, it will be perfectly fine. The baby's fine. Just tell her just not to have sex for 2 weeks. So I didn't tell her that. But Erica went to her doctor a couple days later, and the doctor said the baby's fine. It was an artifact, right? Artifacts can show up in sonograms. They're, distortions of sound waves or whatever. Had nothing to do with the baby. And Erica's placenta hadn't moved yet. It was still low-lying. And the doctor said, your placenta's low-lying. So if you do have sex, which is perfectly safe, you'll probably spot, and then you'll probably freak out, and then you'll probably need another ultrasound, which is totally fine. Just come back. So, of course, all that happened. But that Sophie knew those specific details. It was, I don't know. And again, it was like having Sophie in my life was just so amazing because I almost forgot until, she died about a year ago. And now I'm sort of reflecting on all these stories. And it almost became the ordinary for me. You know what I mean? Like, it almost was like, yeah, I'm going to call Sophie because I'm nervous about whatever. I mean, she was such a dear friend. And, it almost became like an everyday thing. Well, Sophie will tell me what's going to happen or if it's okay or not. And she did. I mean, anyway.
So now that Sophie isn't here and you can't consult her, does that then leave you to begin to find the answers for yourself? Or do you find another psychic, or what happens there?
Oh, that's a great question. So I'm going to completely open up, which this is a little scary. So I met Sophie because I dated her son over 30 years ago. I met him at some random party. I had been out of McLean for a couple of years. I was divorced. I got divorced when I got out of McLean. No, and it sounds awful, but my ex-husband was not a jerk at all. It was like neither of us understood my mental illness. And when I got better, it was clear we weren't really meant for each other. And so I met this man named Kenny at a party, and he's the one who told me about Sophie. And he was also psychic. I remember, and I thought it was the weirdest thing. Like, I had bought him this Christmas present. It was this leather jacket, and I was really excited to give it to him. I knew he would love it, but I was also worried that it was too small. And I sort of said to him, I remember this was one of the first times, I'm like, guess what I got you for Christmas? And he was like, I hate guessing. And I'm like, well, who hates guessing? Like, that's part of the fun of it all. He's like, yeah, no, I hate it because I always get it right. I'm like, that's weird. So I sort of dropped it. And a couple of days later, he was like, and by the way, the 42 will fit me just fine. Don't worry about it. I was like, okay, that was weird. How the hell did you know that? And he was like, I don't know. I just know things. So he came about a year ago to his mother's funeral. I was still married, and it was clear we needed to reconnect. And I know I'm putting this out there. I didn't have an affair. I told my husband at the time, we had been sort of roommates, and I was like, I think I have feelings for somebody else. We hadn't been close for years, but we had a perfectly fine, typical, life of people who are married. Not typical. I shouldn't say typical. We've been married for a long time, but we, went our own ways. And so my husband left. And now I'm with Sophie's son, who's a little psychic. But no, I know that's not why I'm not. Oh my God, that came out.
No, I hear what you're saying. No, it's a part of this backstory. Yeah.
Right. It's just like, I can't believe I connected.
Wow.
Again. And we actually, on New Year's Eve, is right after Sophie died. And this is a complicated story of how I got here. But I knew I'd heard of this woman, Robin, in Connecticut. That was all the information I was given. And I thought it would be fun. And Kenny and I hadn't reconnected at all, but we were just friends. And, he was grieving over his mother's death. And I thought it would be fun to maybe take him to a psychic. Like, I didn't really know. When I looked up this woman and I realized she read cards the exact same way Sophie did, I was like, oh, that's a meant to be thing. Then she had 2 appointments by chance open on New Year's Eve morning. So, I didn't tell him what we were doing. I was like, do you want to go to Connecticut? And he was like, sure. So we went. And this woman knew, she had no idea who I was bringing. And I've been, unfortunately, the fraudulent thing, I have dealt with that as well. And she was amazing. And so she is sort of my go-to psychic at the moment, but it's not the same. She's wonderful. She's great. But yeah, I'm leaning more on myself.
Yeah. Do you think Sophie had anything to do with bringing you and Kenny back together?
I wish I knew. I know when I die, I'll find all this out. But I will say that in the end, the last year of her life, she had a significant dementia. And I still visited her all the time, but less so or I thought it was less so for me. I'd bring her cake and chat with her, and, she'd repeat herself, and she knew who I was, but she didn't remember my children, or, but she'd still, as soon as she saw me, she'd say, I'm going to read your cards. It was like that. She had that connection, right? She knew me was associated with reading my cards, and she still wanted to do that. And I thought, of course I'm going to let her do that. And because I wanted, it was important, I thought, that I be able to come over and have coffee and cake and sit and read cards and chat, just as a way to be a decent human being, I guess I was thinking. But those readings were unbelievably accurate. At the time, I was like, yeah, no, because she kept on talking about an old boyfriend who was coming to town. I'm like, I don't have old boyfriends, right? I've been with so few people. And I was like, if it was Kenny, she would know. And I remember one day she got really annoyed and she couldn't see who it was, because she was like, now who could it be? Sylvia. I'm like, and I just thought it was dementia. Like, I had no idea. She also talked about a document that was missing that I needed to get in order. And if I didn't get this document, that I was, that I could lose a lot of money. And I was like, I couldn't figure it out. My father was also dying at the time, which she knew. And I was the executor of the will of his estate. And I assumed she was talking about some kind of paperwork having to do with his estate. But I was like so careful because of my siblings. I wanted, I was like dotted every I, crossed every T, So I was like, no, I think everything's in order. And she was so insistent that there was a document missing, that if I didn't get it, I really would lose a lot of money. Well, okay, she dies. Kenny comes in. I can't find anywhere my prenup for my marriage. And that, would essentially have lost me a lot of money. I did find it in the attic. There was one copy in the attic in my youngest daughter's second grade art project box.
Oh my gosh, that's so random.
So, right? Like, yeah. I didn't go to file my prenup agreement in the attic in my youngest daughter's second grade art project box. I don't know how the hell it ended up there, but that's the only place it might have been safe. Come to think of it. Like, it was safe up there and nobody else could find it. And I did find it. And so I realized, after she died, all these things that she had told me, dementia is a really interesting thing, because I think there's one part of the brain maybe that can be demented, but there's another part of the brain that's used in, psychic and mediumship that I think was still absolutely purer than ever, in fact.
Yeah. So I've talked to some people on the podcast too and asked them that question about like dementia and Alzheimer's. And I remember someone saying that like it has to also do with the crown chakra. And again, I don't remember exactly what it was that she said, but I was always thinking, about, mental health, or even medical diagnoses that we have that can't really be explained, yet they do seem to tap into consciousness, and like dementia being one of them. And then when you think about how, the physicists talk about consciousness and non-locale and stuff like that, and how consciousness isn't inside the brain, but outside of it. And the fact that she had that and could still read for you and it be so accurate. I mean, that shows that she was tapping into another, not even the brain per se, but into the consciousness system to be able to get that information. That's fascinating.
Right. And it, and it wasn't, and, it's so funny because, and this happened so many times with her. She would tell me things and I was like, oh yeah, that's not true. And, and then she died and all this stuff she said was, and I remember, so Kenny was living out in California. I live in outside of Boston, and in a town called Natick. And I remember this was literally a couple days before she died. She was still in her home. And then at the end, she was in the hospital for the last 2 days, I think, or 3 days. But I was visiting her, and she was like, Kenny's going to move back to Natick. I'm like, why the hell would Kenny ever move back to Natick? You know what I mean? I was like, well, again, it's dementia. And it wasn't. It's just, it's so fascinating. And, you know, as much as my father was against all of this in terms of, you know, he wasn't one, there are physicists who are interested in this stuff and who look at maybe fitting into quantum, you know, mechanics, which is a whole nother thing that I think some people overuse, but I won't go there. But my father, many, many years ago, you know, he had been sort of, I'm going to use the word disgusted, which is strong, but like sort of disgusted with me for going to, you know, a psychic. But he did say all those years ago, he was like, if you're going to go, do your research, you know, collect the data, do it with a do it with a scientific mind. And I mean, I didn't always do it with a scientific mind, but I did in a way. I kept going. I started going to mediums. My daughter called me the medium hunter. You know, I started collecting a lot of data and finding out, unfortunately, some frauds, but many amazing people along the way. So it's been a great journey.
Well, maybe you have to do something with that data and actually put it into a book.
Yeah, well, I am, you know, I have been fiddling with that. It's, you know, it's fun. It's a different kind. It feels much lighter. Sorry. And I know we got way off the book, but
no, that's okay.
It feels like a different kind of book than Where Madness Lies, but a different kind of almost lighter and airier than when you're dealing with the Nazis and mental illness.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
It's a little dark.
Well, going back to the book too, I have a question here. Was your grandfather the doctor of Anne Frank's family? So what's the story behind that?
So my grandfather on my father's side was the doctor of Anne Frank and her family. They lived in Frankfurt before they fled to Amsterdam. And my grandfather, my one grandfather wasn't Jewish and he stayed in Germany. He was a chemist, but this grandfather was Jewish and he absolutely was. I remember him so well. He was just a super kind, gentle soul. And he didn't believe that people would do what they were going to do. And he was literally forced onto a train by his cousin because he wasn't going to leave Germany. I mean, and I think, you know, that's many of us are like that. I mean, we just don't believe. Can't imagine like these horrific things that humans would do to each other. Like, it's just unfathomable. And, you know, he did make it out. They stripped people of their medical degrees if they were Jewish. And so he had to go and get another medical degree in Scotland, which he did. And then he practiced in England. And about 10 years ago, I think the University of Würzburg, where he had gotten his degree, reinstated it. It's a little late, but anyway, he never got over. And I think many people couldn't. It really affected him, that obviously. And my father always said that he died too young because of it. You know, it was too much trauma.
Yeah. So what would you say is your biggest takeaway for Where Madness Lies? You know, what's your hope? What was your hope for writing that book and what people will kind of, you know, take from that? So
there's a lot. There are a number of things, but I'm going to go with the biggest, which is, you know, there is certainly darkness, but my hope is that people see that you can move to the light with being open and revealing the secrets of the past, the trauma of the past, that we can get through that we can get into a place of light and love.
Beautiful. Well said. And I thank you so much for your vulnerability and sharing your stories and allowing us to get to know you on a very personal level. And I know like you said, we kind of got off topic with the book, but I think our listeners just learning about who you are as an author will draw them to the book and want to get in there and support you and read all of this. So I'm happy you reconnected with Kenny.
Thank you.
And the two of you came together.
That was the first time I've shared that.
Yeah, well, it's kind of a beautiful love story. And again, it comes back to your message, right? Finding the light, coming out from the darkness, and it's about love.
Yes, it is.
So perfect. Well, Sylvia, thank you so much. You were a wonderful guest. And why don't you, as we end, just let people know where they can find Where Madness Lies and how they can get in touch with you if they need to.
So I do have a website, sylviatrue.com, and the book, if you Google, if you Google it, it's at any major bookstores and also on Amazon. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you, and much luck to you with this book. And when you write that other one, let us know.
Yes,
And we'll have you back on. Okay. All right. Thanks,
Thank you
Sylvia.
so much, April.
Yes, and thank you everyone for listening today. Take care, everyone.